Welcome to the Fat Emperor podcast. I'm your host, Ivor Cummins. Hey guys, we're back to the metabolic stuff today, and I'm going to be meeting with Graham Phillips, who's a pharmacist, but he's actually the pharmacist who gave up drugs, which makes it especially interesting. So, Graham, great to see you again, and how are you doing?
Ivor, how are you? Yeah, all things considered, given the insanity of what's going on, I'm quite well. Yeah, I think.
Well, we'll avoid getting into the war, as they say, and we'll stick to the metabolic diet, lifestyle, and how to make yourself supremely healthy without necessarily needing those drugs, eh?
Yep, that's the plan. That's the plan.
And we might start with a brief background from yourself, and maybe I'll give one too for your listeners.
Yeah, so like most health professionals, I've had my own health journey, and I was steeped in the perceived wisdom: eat a little less, move a little bit more. Fats make you fat. I spent years avoiding red meat, having everything low fat and therefore high sugar, and found myself getting hungrier and hungrier and simultaneously fatter and fatter. And in the end, I think it's very tempting as a health professional when your patients don't do very well to just assume that they're not following your advice. But when it's you know you're following the advice and it's not working. So that kind of made me open to new ideas. And actually, what brought me into this space originally was two things. One was the original 5-2 diet, which I thought, well, I could do that. And I rapidly lost 10 kilos. And I thought, okay, well, that's not the usual calories in, calories out stuff. Why? And the other one was Iran Segal's talk about personalized diet and the role of the microbiome. And I guess it started from there. What about you?
Yeah, well, I just got some poor blood tests, and they were routine tests, nothing special. And three of the values, the cholesterol, the ferritin, and the GGT, the liver enzyme, were way out of whack. And because I'm 20 years in problem solving and all, and I was a biochemical engineering degree, even though I hadn't worked too much in bio, I just looked at the numbers and I knew they were crazy special in a bad way. And long story short, I grilled the doctor on A, what would cause these? How do I fix them? And B, what's the implications of these values so high? And I didn't get good answers. So I went to a more experienced doctor and then a professor of medicine, and I couldn't get the answers. So I knew if these are standard blood tests and they can't even give a decent answer to those two crucial questions on any problem, there's something massively wrong here. Didn't know what it was. But long story short, again, I hit ResearchGate, PubMed, went after the metrics, researched all the papers, human studies over 50 years, tons of stuff. And within 3 weeks, I realized carbohydrate is the problem. So sugars, refined carbohydrates, certainly. So I went on a very low carb diet, realized as within a week or two, I realized I could skip meals with impunity. And that was unexpected. I realized my appetite was under control for the first time in my adult life. And after an 8.5, 9 weeks, I had lost 30 pounds without really trying, and 15 kilos nearly. And my blood markers were just all fixed. And they all got way better. The other ones that weren't too bad. So that was it. So I became a zealot, going out there making videos to let everyone know cholesterol is not the problem. Fat is not the problem. Sugar and carbs and refined foods are the problem, and vegetable oils. And that was it.
In fact, I call them the trifecta of evils, just exactly that combination found in the bliss point foods of sugar, carbs, and processed seed oils. But it's bizarre, isn't it? Because health professionals are not stupid. You were able to find that out for yourself, what, in 8 weeks? And after you'd found it, you were able to reverse your metabolic syndrome, what, in another few weeks?
Yeah, well, basically 3 week study, and thereupon I switched hardcore to the diet. It was just very low carb, started eating fatty meat, fish, eggs, very low carb, no processed food, no sugars, no orange juice, which I used to drink a lot of, fresh orange juice. And I cut out the vegetable oils too. And it was from that point, over the next 8.5 weeks, I dramatically fixed the bloods. And my blood pressure, I noticed a week or two in, before any weight came off, my blood pressure began to plummet from kind of hypertensive, been like that for years. It came right down. And I noticed I haven't even lost weight yet, really. So the metabolic fix was already working on the blood pressure, you know.
Which kind of begs a question, doesn't it? Because health professionals are not stupid and they're not evil. And yet you found this out in what, a month's research, another 8 weeks of implementation. What's wrong with health professionals, do you think?
Yeah, the problem is, and it's not per se their fault, the problem is that the education for health professionals and for nutritionists particularly, they have a paradigm that was incorrect but fully accepted by everyone. You know, everyone can't be wrong. And that was the cholesterol and the fat nonsense. The heart healthy vegetable oils was pushed remorselessly since the 70s. And that's all part of their education. So when all these nutritionists come out of college, they are utterly imbued in this incorrect information. And it's very offensive to tell them you're actually wrong. That means their whole degree, their whole college education, every expert in the world almost, they're all wrong. It sounds ridiculous. So that's why they're completely inculcated in this. And then the doctors only do a few hours of nutrition. So they're utterly dependent on the nutritionists who are wrong. So everyone's caught up. And the problem really is, Graham, I think the killer is they cannot believe that everyone is wrong, that all the experts are wrong. So they can't even face up to a different paradigm or re-looking at it. It's unthinkable for them.
It is, except for a few of us who have been on this journey and have realised it. One of the things I always say when I give talks to health professionals, once you've seen this with your own eyes, you can't unsee it. It's just impossible for me now to go and practice in the conventional way that I used to. And when I'm working on the front line in the pharmacy now, heart sync doesn't really sum it up because I'm handing out statins and hypertensives, antihypertensives, anti-diabetics, and all the time I'm thinking we're looking through the wrong end of the telescope. Yeah, the money is there in the system. We could fix it if we only invested in preventive public health and eating real food instead of waiting. And all of us as health professionals, our training is this: wait for the symptoms to develop and then suppress the symptoms one by one with the drugs on an evidence-based basis. And that is the particular expertise of the pharmacist, which is how do you get the most bang for your buck out of the drugs budget? And we're good at that. But of course, we don't test the paradigm, which is what's the single root cause? And we're all born into this milieu of escalating a metabolic disease. We know that everyone's getting fatter and more diabetic by the day, but no one looks at the natural history of it, tracks it, and thinks, what's the root cause? Which is, of course, the journey I've been on. And that's been a fascinating journey. But I tell you what, I'm bloody angry now because I realised A, I was practicing the wrong way for most of my professional career, and B, I've been duped.
Yeah, there's certainly an element of duped about it. And a very senior physician, way back when I discovered this, I remember I pointed him in the right direction towards insulin resistance, and he wasn't even familiar with it. And a week or two later, I met him at a family function. And I said, well, did you check this stuff out? Because he was sure it was cholesterol was the problem. And he didn't understand this insulin thing. He kind of said to me, what, for diabetics? He only knew it as a drug. So a couple of weeks later, he just whispered to me, he says, Ivor, we've been duped. And he was speaking about his whole profession because he realized after a week or two, glancing at the links I sent him, he realized it was never the cholesterol. It was almost all the insulin. And he just thought, oh my God, I've spent 30 years being completely wrong. But he told me afterwards as well that the problem is, again, the education system, that pharmaceutical companies have inveigled their way into the medical education system, supporting grants and schools. And they've kind of just encouraged the incorrect paradigms over the last 30 years. So they didn't actually, it's not a conspiracy. Industry didn't make up all this nonsense. The nonsense was actually a mistake by academics back in the 60s and 70s. But industry has certainly realized decades ago this nonsense is good nonsense. So they've supported it.
No, I think that's true. Well, we've talked about the trifecta of evil. Maybe we should say a little bit about more about that, and also how all of this plays into cardiometabolic disease. Should we start with seed oils or should we start with sugar? What do you think?
Oh, maybe get seed oils out of the way. It's a controversial one.
Okay, so It's interesting, isn't it? If you, I've looked. If you look at the history of these diseases and you follow the Weston A. Price Foundation, there's some very interesting, informative stuff. As I'm sure you know, Weston A. Price was actually a dentist, and I think an American dentist, and went around the world and discovered that you could go to a country, and where there was a port and lots of industrialization and westernization, everyone was sick and ill and had terrible teeth. And you could go 10 miles down the road, and people were living a fairly normal existence for them. So they were eating a traditional food, having a traditional lifestyle 10 or 15 miles away because communications were poor. And they were muscular, they were fit, they were healthy, and their dental and the state of their dentition was fantastic. And he started to realize then, which is what, early 20th century, that this whole westernized lifestyle is causing absolute havoc. And of course, we've been sold these pups. So the brief history, I think we could maybe start with something that was originally called Crispo, but ended up being called Crisco, which is that the seed industry, back in the day when everyone was mainly using natural fibers, the cotton seeds were left over. And they were able to, by industrial processing of cotton seeds, they could force an oil out of them. And I always, when I talk to people, I say, if you get an olive and you squeeze it in your hand, it's oily, right? If you get an avocado and squeeze it in your hand, it's oily. Get some seeds and squeeze it, not a lot of oil happening. And what they did was they managed to industrially process the oils. And originally, the first oil, I think, was actually to run the engines of German submarines, right? And of course,
Yeah.
it's successful in its way, but there's not. I think there were only 100 German diesel submarines at the time, so it wasn't really a business. And that was oil. Oil was then sold to a British company who started making soap from it, but people made their own soap. And then it was sold on to Procter and Gamble, the huge American conglomerate. And they were good at soap making and they were good at marketing. And they thought, well, we'll make a fortune out of this. And they made the soap. But again, it didn't really succeed because still people were making their own soap. And we're at what, mid 20th century and or early 20th century. And then two things happened. Ansel Keys, with his diet heart hypothesis, it was all about saturated fat, was on the board of Procter and Gamble. And Procter and Gamble decided that if they further industrialized and processed these oils, and these oils, if you look at them, they're made in factories that look like petroleum processing plants, that they would say, well, they're low in cholesterol, heart healthy oils. And the rest, as they say, is history. But the truth of the matter is that these oils are, because they're polyunsaturated, in other words, there's lots of double bonds between the carbons, they can oxidize very rapidly. And it's the oxidation that then gets into your bloodstream and into not your cholesterol, but your lipids. And that is what damages and destroys your cardiovascular system.
Yeah, and indeed these become incorporated in the shells of all your trillions of cholesterol particles, your lipoproteins, and indeed your body cells, your endothelial cells and your arteries. You're overloading. Your fat cells get stuffed with polyunsaturates. Your body's trying to store all of these delicate molecules that nature never intended you to have. But I love the way I have a video I sent out years ago, and we put a link in our book to that very plant. And I saved it to the hard drive in case the video disappeared. But it was a how it works. And just one look at all these people going around in white suits and respirators and these huge machines and extraction with hexanes, petrochemical solvents. And you're just saying, wow, that's food. And one person described it as the runoff from an industrial settling tank. It's just incredibly disgusting. And yet it was bleached, coloured, and prepped, and all the stinking molecules that was nature's warning not to touch this, they're all chemically removed. So you end up with what looks like and can be marketed as a pure oil. Remember Flora? It wouldn't even stop a watch. Never mind your heart. This is the problem, marketing.
It was marketed like Castrol GTX. Do you remember Castrol GTX?
I remember the oil bead goes down and it spells out the name.
Good engineering, right? And I
Yeah.
reckon it's the same marketing agency, So It's not about the cholesterol. This is another of the myths, which the
Mm.
cholesterol is a bad thing and cholesterol is going to kill you. Cholesterol, of course, is of such fundamental importance that almost every cell in the body can produce its own cholesterol. And it's the fundamental basis of our hormones, of our cell membranes, it's in our brain. Why would you want less of that? It's the stuff of life. But of course, we've
Well,
been convinced by the statin industry that the less cholesterol, the better. So let's tell the truth, which is it's nothing to do. Well, it's not. There is an indirect relationship with cholesterol, which is the cholesterol transport mechanisms, the lipoproteins, which transport the output to the liver around the body. And it's when those that get damaged and oxidized that you end up with a cardiovascular disease. Cholesterol is a bit of a bystander, isn't it?
yeah, essentially. And then the way is Dr. Gerber, my co-author, always says it's the quality of your cholesterol particles, not the amount. And that's a good way to think of it. My cholesterol can be through the roof, but if it's high quality and undamaged and working properly, then it's fine. Or I could be low cholesterol, but I've got bad ratios and oxidized particles, and I'm in serious trouble. It's not the amount. And something occurs to me just from a few minutes ago. You mentioned Weston Price, and just before we finished in the seed oils, Weston Price took a guess at what the components were that were causing the modern foods to be so bad in the cities. And he said sugars, refined grains, and vegetable fats. So I always thought that Weston Price mainly fingered the sugars and the wheat and the grains. But it was pointed out to me a few years ago by Tucker Goodrich that he also mentions the vegetable fats, which you described. They were being brought into Africa, into the cities too. And one other interesting thing is Mann et al., who did the big study on the Maasai hearts in the late 60s. And they found that they had big, thick arteries and they had a form of atheroma, but it wasn't atherosclerosis as we know it. They had fibrous plaque, but it didn't cause them any problem. And they didn't have any soft lipid filled plaque like we're cursed with. But also, interestingly, while they observed the incredible heart health, they also took a shot at what they thought was the factor that caused the atherosclerosis, dietary factor. And you know what they came up with? Sugar, refined grains, and vegetable fats. So you had Weston Price and you had Mann et al.'s landmark autopsy research 50 years apart, and they both took a shot at what the problem components were. And guess what? They're the devil's triad. I see. And they got it right.
Yeah, yeah. So if we kind of look at health professionals don't know this, right? We're born into this milieu of escalating cardiovascular disease. As I said earlier on, we know that everyone's getting fatter and more diabetic, but we don't know the natural history of it. So all these diseases, type 2 diabetes, dementia, cardiovascular disease, etc. First of all, we know that they're found in the same group of people, but we don't really connect the dots. And neither do we know that they're all man-made diseases. They simply didn't exist 120 years ago. And then we're told, oh, well, yeah, but people died too young. So what's the truth behind that one?
Oh, yeah, the dying too young is nonsense. So we know that the age on average of someone who lives healthily is into the 80s and even up over 100. That's just what we're encoded for. And it takes 15 or 20,000 years for a genetic shift or adaptation. So 10, 15,000 years ago, we were the same machines. So infant mortality, communicable diseases, animal attacks, infections, all of that massive array of stuff is what pulled the life expectancy down for those ancient people, and even up to the early 1900s, and hygiene problems, all of that stuff. But they're the same machines as us. And even if you're genetically predisposed towards heart disease, which some people really are, it just means you need to be even more careful with the diet and lifestyle. So there's no human who's genetically, well, okay, a tiny percentage have genetic issues. But the worst you can be as a human is susceptible to modern diet and lifestyles causing your heart to burn out. It's still always the diet and lifestyle that's, or a lack of minerals and vitamins that are key. It's always the environment that makes you check out early, almost exclusively. Otherwise, your target is into the 80s if you do everything right.
The example I always give is that if a woman has two children, one of whom dies in childbirth and the second lives till 80, the average life expectancy is 40 years, right? Doesn't deny the fact that the other child lived into their 80s, but we as health professionals are never told that.
Yeah, the infant mortality was an enormous chunk of that reduced expectancy. And we know this from all the people back, back in the war era and everything. You have people living to 100 and more, even who are in concentration camps. You know, the human machine, on average, the target is the 80s and above generally. And that would have been the same in the people 10,000 years ago, only they had just so many adverse circumstances. But one of them wasn't diet. Though Dr. Mike Eads does make a great case for the atherosclerosis in the Egyptians, in the mummies that they scanned with calcium scanning. But then he pointed out, he went through all of their diet, the masses of the Egyptians, and they actually were heavily dependent on grain and breads, right, wheat, and they ate a lot of kind of chicken and other stuff with a lot of polyunsaturates. So they basically were eating the perfect, healthy whole grain, unprocessed, low fat, high polyunsaturated diet. And yeah, of course they got a bit of atherosclerosis.
Of course, what also health professionals aren't aware of with these so-called healthy whole grains, I guess we can move on to the sugars and the carbs now, is that the whole wheat industry has been genetically modified to an unbelievable degree in the last, 150 years. So the healthy whole grains that we talk about now are nothing like the healthy whole grains that our ancestors would have eaten. In fact, I'm just in the process. I know you've interviewed William Davis a couple of times, and I'm just in the process of reading his book at the moment, Wheat Belly.
Yeah, that's a great book, and Bill is fantastic. He's just so super smart, and he worked out himself observationally from his patients. He got curious because he saw that no matter what your cholesterol was, it didn't affect when he opened them up and looked at their arteries. It had no correlation. So, well, what is it? So, over a period of a year or two, he used to quiz them and ask them about what they ate and everything. And he found that the common thread was wheat and wheat products was the thing that stood out for the people with the worst arteries. And then he went on and did the full research, as you say. But yeah, the original, spelt and einkorns way, way back, eaten in their natural form largely, they were not nearly so problematic. But the modern wheats, dwarf wheat, bred in the 50s and 60s to feed the world, it's basically got way more gluten, gliadin, wheat germ, agrogluten, WGA. It's got all of these bad things, and they're refining it, which removes the structure and makes your insulin shoot up much higher, even for the same number of calories of the same wheat. If it's refined into powders, which it all is basically, it's going to be explosive for GIP hormone and insulin. And they've basically made the worst food in the world out of something that was a kind of a staple thousands of years ago that wasn't so bad at all, really.
That's right. So we've I think the journey starts at the early 19th century, late 18th century with the introduction of seed oils. And of course, that seed oil consumption has gone on and on and on. It continues to rise. And I think I think in America, 60% of calories are ultra processed, based in ultra processed food. And we in the UK are not very far behind. So
Yeah.
we've had the one problem with the seed oils, and then we had a second problem starting in the 60s and 70s with the move away from fats towards, well, if you take the fats out of the diet, because following Ansel Keys' theory is the fats are what are the causing of the heart attacks, that you have to replace it with something. There's only three macros, right? Proteins, fats, and carbs. Most people can only eat so much protein. So if you remove the fats, you end up with more carbs. So not only are you eating more carbs, the carbs that we're eating, as I say, have been completely genetically modified. So I think we should maybe talk a bit about that.
There's kind of the GMOs, which I don't know so much about, but the breeding, the classic genetic changing by just breeding, created the dwarf wheats and all without even having the modern technology of GMO. But I guess GMO is probably just adding more problems, I guess, though I don't know much about it.
So we get to the sort of 60s and 70s, and all the guidance starts to change. Avoid the fats, and then people actually, what's remarkable is how compliant the public is. So far from actually not following the guidance, actually, it's by following the guidance they've all become fatter, sicker, and more diabetic. Now, most of my clients are very well aware of sugar. And so they eat healthy porridge for breakfast because that's not sugar, is it? And then they have a sandwich lunch with some more complex carb. And in the evening, have a salad with some potatoes. And that's what they think is a healthy diet. Because what they don't know, and I think what health professionals have forgotten, is these complex carbs based in starches, when you look at the chemistry, it's just glucose molecules stuck together with an oxygen. And when you metabolize it, you end up with glucose, which is why, your so-called whole grain rice, your seed bread, your porridge in the morning is just a ton of sugar, almost devoid of nutrition. But the effect of the huge increase in sugar in your bloodstream is to raise your insulin. And that does two or three things. I mean, I always describe insulin as a sort of master hormone. And I kind of say that if you think about the body is full of servo mechanisms. So when you move an arm like that, you've got one muscle smoothly contracting and one muscle doing the reverse. And so long as they're in balance, it's fine. And I kind of think of diabetes and metabolic syndrome as a kind of spasm of the endocrine system, driven primarily by this master hormone insulin. If you raise your blood glucose, because blood sugar is very, very tightly controlled by the body, it's homeostasis, you will raise your insulin. And the insulin will sweep the extra sugar out of your bloodstream, and and whatever you're not burning, and of course most of us are taking in more calories than we're consuming at any one time, the excess is stored first of all as glycogen, and when your glycogen stores are full, it's stored as fat, which is why it isn't the fat that makes you fat, it's actually the sugar and the carbs.
Yeah, and there's so many loops in there of control that work for tens of thousands of years to control appetite. But of course, when you become hyperinsulinemic and insulin resistant, you also become leptin resistant, and all of the long-term and short-term appetite control systems kind of don't work anymore. So it's metabolic mayhem, is what myself and Dr. Gerber used the phrase. The control systems were never designed evolutionarily to deal with modern processed food. So you can't blame evolution or the creator, if whatever your belief is. You can't blame it because it can only adapt over long periods. But like you said, this suddenly exploded in the 20th century. So we can't adapt as humans to it. So the control systems go crazy. And I always think of what Dr. Ted Naiman, I interviewed him. He's a buddy of mine over in Seattle, and he's a great guy. But he said, maybe over the next 20,000 years of eating Twinkies and bread and Coca-Cola, we'll become these super, resistant cockroach type creatures. But it's not going to happen too quickly. And the other thing he said was, always think nutrient density, which is a great belief of mine as well. Whatever I eat, get as many nutrients per calorie as you can get. And that tells you the perfect diet. Because if you follow that, you end up eating mostly meat, fish, and eggs and nutrient-dense, vegetables. And you're never going to get down to bread and kind of potatoes. Potatoes, what? A bit of potassium? Forget about it. Meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, and avocados have lots of nutrients, and nuts. You can actually tell what the best diet is just by the rule of nutrient density.
I completely agree. I kind of think that we've inverted the pyramid. So the Western diet is full of calories and devoid of nutrition.
Yeah.
And actually, when I'm thinking about what I eat, I'm always thinking about what's the maximum amount of nutrition I can have for the minimum number of calories, because I just don't need the calories. We're not burning them.
Yeah, and you know what I do though? I've been very bad during lockdown, and as you're well aware, I'm very engaged in this challenge, 7 days a week. I'm quite passionate about it. But because I've been working so hard and in a lockdown mode, I've put on weight and I've slipped a little. But I'll fix that. But the thing is, I generally eat a big nutrient dense good meal with what we described once a day almost. I've kind of gotten a one meal a day habit. And it's not for everyone. It won't work for everyone. It kind of works for me. I work all day and I just have coffee. But when I do feel like something in the day, every second day I might decide I'll get something, middle of the day. And I find if you get 4 egg yolks, I drain a little bit of the white out like a baker does when you're baking. I crack the shell, drain a little white out, and it can be used elsewhere. And I put mostly yolks into a little buttered ramekin dish. And I use the microwave. I know some people don't like microwaves, but I microwave it in bursts of 20 seconds to stop it exploding. And you can get to a very nice 4 egg yolk mini omelette. And then you get sea salt and crumbly salt and put lots of salt in it because we need salts. And it's an incredible snack. And it's ultra nutrient dense, right? Egg yolks, with salt. Wow.
Right off the eggs, haven't we, because of this cholesterol myth. And I always say to people, eggs are they're cheap as chips. We shouldn't talk about chips. And B, they're about as nutritionally balanced as you could want. And of course, they've got almost no carb in.
Yep.
We've been frightened off them, haven't we?
Yeah, there's another report came out of China the other day, and I can't believe these jokers in the media. They're still talking about 1 egg extra a week gives you 6% more heart disease. Associational junk studies, worthless. I mean, literally toilet papers. That's what I call them. But they go all through the media. And then the next week they say, oh, eggs are okay. And then the next week they say eggs kill you. So, I mean, you can't blame the people and even the doctors. You're listening to all this junk wondering, well, what is the truth? But we know that.
And I think all of this confusion benefits the food industry. Because as a health professional, I've only recently stumbled upon the truth, and it is stumbled across the truth. And the same thing's true of all the people in this space, whether it's David Unwin, whether it's Asim Malhotra, Tim Noakes. We've all kind of serendipitously stumbled across the truth. If the health professionals are confused, it's very small wonder that the patients are, and then we blame the patients. And of course, it benefits the food industry because the maximum amount of confusion, in the end, you give up and you carry on eating whatever's advertised to you, which is where their profits come from.
Yeah, and the food industry and pharma, two of the biggest industries in the world, and they're best buddies. And, they're just both making out like bandits. So the food industry is making an absolute fortune by making people fat and diabetic with these foods we talked about and the devil's triad. When they become overweight, sadly, there's this terrible thing because, as we said, the control system gets broken. They actually become more hungry because the control system no longer works, and they become more hungry as they get fatter, the opposite of what it should do. So they eat more and they become super consumers. So food industry is making out like bandits. But the problematic metabolic mess that they're making of the population, well, that massively benefits the pharmaceutical industry. So most people are on antihypertensives now because most people have metabolic syndrome and the insulin resistance drives up their blood pressure. So they're all making out like unbelievably. And of course, they're piling some of those profits back into marketing and education for doctors and nutritionists, right? To make sure that the paradigm stays alive. Because, I mean, someone said, I think it was Professor Noakes, that if tomorrow everyone started eating real food, dropped all the nonsense, and generally ate real food, within a year or two, 3 out of the major 6 pharmaceutical companies would have to merge or go out of business. Because the whole business is built on chronic disease. And if everyone switched to a kind of low carbs real food, the business would collapse. At least many of them. And that's why, and they know this. They're not stupid. They're smart. They know this.
The example I always give, because as I say, I've discovered this serendipitously, really. In 1994, the chief executives of the 5 big tobacco companies appeared in front of the Senate. And all of them in 1994 saw an affidavit that in their best understanding of the science, there was no link between smoking and lung cancer. Not in 1934, not in 1954, but you can find it on YouTube still. It's 1994. And I just think we're up against, if you think the smoking industry is a big paradigm, put big food in one corner and big pharma in the other. It makes the tobacco industry look modest in its intention, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, and absolutely. And to be honest, smoking was so bloody obvious, right? Even people just kind of instinctively knew it, and yet they managed to maintain for 30 years that nonsense. Whereas pharma and food, it's not blindingly obvious at all what we're saying. In fact, all of the knowledge says the opposite, right? So they have a much easier job of cheating, lying, and keeping this nonsense alive. Much easier than tobacco companies did, even. So here we are. It's a challenge. But you know what we should get onto is, I mentioned at the start, the pharmacist who gave up drugs. We should curl around now to what you've been doing in terms of helping people to, well, basically understand what we're saying and then coax them through the process of switching over to a long-term healthy lifestyle. So I hasten to add, it's not about a diet. I'm going to do a diet for 6 weeks. I'm going to lose 5 pounds. That's pointless. You're going to put it back on again. It's a mental shift to a new way of living that's better in every way that you're going to continue with for the rest of your life. It's not a sentence. It's a better way of living. You're going to have a higher quality of life. Everything will be better. And you're making that switch. That's the way I view it.
So the brief history is that, having been on this journey and discovered it for myself, and then I realized that the microbiome has a huge effect. So one way that you can be less hungry and have less insulin is completely to cut the carbs out. The trouble with that is a lot of people struggle with that. And I've had one of my clients said, you know what, if it's a choice between eating the bread and taking the metformin, I'll carry on with the metformin and eat the bread. It's a fair choice. So he's a guy, he's in his 80s, he's entitled to make that choice. So there's a more subtle approach which goes like this. Not all carbs have the same effect, and the degree to which any particular carb, so we've got this average thing called the glycemic index, right? And the glycemic index is an index that shows, relative to sugar, how high your blood sugar will be when you eat a certain portion of this food, that food, or the other food. And that works really well. We know that this is kind of bell-shaped natural curve, and that works well if everyone is in the middle. But if you've got a very wide curve, the people at this end and that end have equal and opposite results. And I became fascinated by the Israeli research. And what they did was they followed a group of, I think, 1,000 people. They got them to record everything that they ate. They gave them a continual blood glucose monitor so they could see how their sugars were spiking in relationship. And also they did microbiome analysis. Then they were able to show a direct correlation between individual sugar responses to food, or glycemic responses to different meals in different individuals, was driven primarily by their microbiome. Fascinating. And I then put the two and two together. So by this stage, I'd understood, actually, I came later on the CDOS, but by this stage, I'd understood that basically fat doesn't make you fat. And what drives your hunger is insulin, and the fact you're storing all the energy rather than being able to consume it, which explains where you get fatter and fatter and hungrier and sicker and sicker. And it also explains why no diets work. All diets work for 3 months, because you can kind of starve yourself into submission for 3 months. And then after 3 months, because you're fighting your natural physiology, you become hungry. And in fact, I had a podcast recently with Tim Noakes, and we went through this whole thing that what makes you fat is being hungry. And if you weren't hungry, you wouldn't be fat anymore. When the continual blood glucose monitors became more available, although they were only available in a very limited way on the NHS, I thought, well, let's put theory into practice. And one of my mates, and I can talk about Jeremy because he's one of the testimonials on my website, and Jeremy and I have been friends since we were in our mid-20s. Now, Jeremy wasn't particularly fat, but he'd had problems with his blood pressure since his 30s. And he'd been seeing a leading professor of cardiology for 30 odd years. And every time he'd go back to see this guy, he'd either had another dose or another drug. And that's the way, to give you an idea, this is how we treat hypertension. We pick the first drug and we titrate the drug either up to the maximum for that drug or the maximum that the person can withstand without side effects. Then we add a second, then we add the third. Suffice it to say that Jeremy was now on his fourth drug. They'd added doxazosin to the mix. And albeit was controlling his blood pressure, he was getting side effects. And I said to Jem, Jem's a health entrepreneur, very bright guy, actually, of the engineering background. So, common purpose with you, maybe, Ivor. And I said, Jem, you'll love this. Let's have a go. So I put the continual blood glucose monitor on him. Next morning, huge sugar spike. So I just sent him a little WhatsApp and said, "What do you have for breakfast, Jem?" "Oh, my usual morning all brown." So I said, "Jem, that's just sugar." And he didn't know. He said, "Well, what shall I have for breakfast?" I said, "Well, have an omelette for breakfast. Cheese one day, avocado the next." The weight just fell off him. I think within a month, he'd lost 12 kilos. And his blood pressure now was in his boots because he was taking all the drugs. So he said to me, "Well, what shall I do?" I said, "Well, I could do a medicines use review, but you've been seeing a cardiologist for 30 years. Go back and see the cardio." Well, I think it was another couple of weeks had gone by the time he got to see the cardiologist. And, his blood pressure was like sub-zero by then. And the cardiologist, these are the words of the cardiologist: "I've never seen anything like this in my entire professional career," right? Bear in mind, he'd been seeing this guy for 30 odd years. And every year, every review, there was only ever an upward tweak in the drugs. Halved his drugs overnight.
Yeah.
And we're now 2-3 years on. As you say, it's a lifestyle, not a diet. I've had no clinical contact with Jeremy ever since then. He lost 23 kilos ultimately. He was slimmer now than he was in his 20s, off all the drugs. But he carried on taking the statin because I couldn't convince him he didn't need it. And
Yeah.
just as you say, the blood pressure comes down so quickly because once you understand what we talk about, health professionals talk about essential hypertension, right? What does that mean? I think it's just we don't know what it's caused by. There's nothing essential about hypertension. I mean, you need some pressure in your cardiovascular system to make the thing go round. But this idea that hypertension is essential and inevitable is complete rubbish. I reject it.
Yeah.
And
Actually,
blood pressure comes down so quickly.
yeah, no, it's amazing to watch, and it almost universally, unless someone has a very special kidney issue or something, it's almost universal when you do this. But the other phrase is, of course, idiopathic hypertension, meaning hypertension with no specific known cause. One of my doctor buddies in the States said it's called idiopathic because the idiots don't understand that it's insulin resistance. But these are dramatic, and Dr. Unwin, of course, did the study, and he's been great to publish blood pressure, hypertension, and insulin resistance. And also he published on the massive savings in pharmaceuticals that just his own practice enabled in a year. It was something like, I don't know, 50,000 sterling, and that's just one practice. So, like, this is revolutionary, and yet almost no one gets to really find out about it.
So Jeremy was my first client, really, very just as a trial. And of course, I'm a scientist. I know that n=1 is completely meaningless. But I thought, okay, we're onto something here. Let's try it with other people. So we tried it with different ages. We tried it with both sexes. We tried it with people with different conditions. And blow me down, whether it was by diabetes, hypertension, obesity, overweight, I kept getting these incredible results. And the results were so much better than I'd ever got with the drugs, which is why I became the pharmacist that gave up drugs. So we ran the service for about 6 months within our group of pharmacists is called Man of Pharmacy, and we've won pretty much all the national awards, most of them twice. So we're an award-winning group of pharmacies with a lot of advanced practice. But it blew away anything I'd ever achieved previously. And I thought, I'm onto something here. Anyway, long story short, I got so despondent about what we were doing in the pharmacies that I became so enthused by what I was doing with this service that I actually sold most of the pharmacies. We've gone from 10 branches down to 3, still 3 quite busy pharmacies. And we decided to go through brand creation, and we created a brand called ProLongevity. And I think that the ProLongevity now is outside the pharmacies, and it's a complete service.
Yeah, and that's pretty much growing, is it? And not too interrupted by the whole viral challenge we've seen.
No, what's interesting is I think that we've kind of become used to people being fat, right? It's almost become the norm, and it's become unremarkable until Boris got ill. And I think a lot of people, not only it was an awakening for him that you can't outrun a bad diet, or in his case, you can't outcycle a bad diet, but people are starting to realize increasingly that obesity has very profound long-term consequences way beyond the cosmetic. And we know that the worst outcomes in COVID are people who are overweight and diabetic. Superimposed on that, you've got age and ethnicity. But, being obese and diabetic is a huge predictor of a poor outcome. So what that has done is brought a lot of people to my door who might have said, well, I'm quite happy taking the medication and I'm not too worried about my weight. And interestingly, I think a growing understanding of the relation between all these diseases, the interrelationship with COVID, and the fact that we can do something about it quite rapidly and improve people's immune systems, it's grown. So we're kind of, each year, this is our fourth year, and each year it's doubled. And during the COVID pandemic, actually it accelerated quite fast. But my long-term vision goes a bit beyond a kind of fantastic boutique service, much as I'm loving it. I know that and this may sound ridiculous to you, Ivor, but there's a view that we could rid the world of malaria. My vision is to rid the world of type 2 diabetes, because there's nothing about us that means we have to have diabetes. There's nothing inherent it's purely driven by lifestyle, or in 99% of cases. I'm sure you'd agree. So the longer term plan is to take longevity into an electronic space. So we've got quite a big government grant now to develop apps, AI and big data. And also we're working with one of the leading schools of pharmacy. We're hoping to get a PhD. So I'm hoping 2 or 3 years down the road, we'll be able to scale it through the use of big data and apps, and internationalize it, and also have PhD level outcome data.
Excellent. And in the shorter term, then, you're obviously expanding. You're able to scale without having all the AI and all of the apps kind of developed yet, obviously, but you continue to be able to scale. And is it for people locally, or can you take on clients like, remotely, worldwide, that kind of thing?
We are scaling. I'm in the process of training 3 other community pharmacists. They're on the program themselves, and they will ultimately be providers. We've got a few nurses who are very interested, and a couple of nutritionalists. So as my clinical workload exceeds my ability to service my clients, we're bringing other people in. So we are scaling. We are scaling as we speak. And I guess the other kind of benefit, if we can call it that, is that people now realize you can get a service like this in any part of the country, in any part of the world, because we can post the sensors. So as part of the program, everyone gets the continual blood glucose monitors. Plus they get our clinical input, and we don't limit the amount of clinical input. You get as much as you need, as much guidance as you need and we meet people. Typically we meet them for an hour and a half at the start. We meet and at the end, I gave them an hour and a half of education, like you and I are talking, and then tell them to forget everything I've just taught them and just carry on as usual. And during that kind of 2-week interregnum, we can then see how their lifestyle articulates with their blood glucose. And also we get the standard GP tests, liver function tests, HbA1c, lipid profiles. And then we typically meet them 2 weeks later. And then we've got all the tests. So we've got baseline biometric data, but we can also see how they relate to their lifestyle. And it's very individual. And we make our first intervention at that point. And then after that, we would typically meet by Zoom or FaceTime or whichever version works for people every couple of weeks. So we're at the point now we can provide it to anyone in the UK, no problem at all. We've got a couple of clients in Israel. We've got a client in Dubai. We're starting to break slowly into the American market. So it's a long answer to a short question, but we can provide it to anyone. Our only limitation currently is their ability to speak English.
Ah, right. Well, yeah, little more scaling before you bring in a team of translators, in fairness. That's excellent, Graham. So basically, through your website, and we'll put the link below, technically it's anywhere in the world. And I guess they get their local, under your direction after their couple of weeks, they can get their blood tests locally because they're kind of internationally pretty standard anyway. So they can go to their local GP or service or phlebotomist And then they've got that data, and you don't need any advanced like microbiome testing per se at this point. You're inferring their ideal personalization from how their blood glucose is behaving, which is actually an excellent way to do it, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I've got so used to reading the standard GP tests, which is probably a discussion for another day. There are all sorts of problems with GP tests. First of all, people look at cholesterol and they don't look at lipid profile. Secondly, the HbA1c on its own is meaningless unless you know
Yeah.
insulin. So there are a small number of clients with autoimmune disease or more complex disease where we might go into microbiome analysis and we might get into an advanced lipid panel. But I would
But
say 5%, 95% of them, I've got so used to recognizing the clinical symptoms of cardiometabolic disease. I've got so used to reading the GP biometric tests, and I can actually see what's going on because we've got the continual blood glucose monitor. We can see that people are hyperinsulinemic because they're then prone to hypos and they feel shit. And I've had quite a few menopausal women who think they've got menopausal symptoms, but actually the symptoms they're getting, waking in the middle of the night with night sweats and feeling dreadful, is because they're having a profound hypo.
so hypoglycemia and those sugar collapses are really the root underlying it all. But of course, they have no idea because, well, as we spoke earlier, people are not aware of sugar. They're aware of their own bloody cholesterol, all right, which is largely meaningless. Yeah.
So
So,
for 95% of our clients, we don't need more complex tests. For those clients who just want the reassurance of more complex tests, we can provide it privately, but it's an investment they have to make. On the other hand, it's an investment that could bring 10 or 20 healthy, vital years to their life. So I think it's a modest investment.
oh, for sure. And in fairness, that's exactly what I kind of would have expected. There's a small percentage of people with special causes, special issues, and they need to be addressed. But the vast majority, it's pretty much as we described. It's just tailoring the diet individually to an extent, broad principles, and then individualized. And I remember that Israeli research, or maybe it was others, where they saw some people who ice cream shot their glucose up, but beans did not. And then there were other people where it was the reverse. So even within the carbohydrates, there's certain ones for certain people that cause the damage based on their physiology and their microbiome and their personal makeup. So individualization, very important aspect. And it looks like you're all over that.
We call it precision nutrition. Yeah.
Ah, exactly. So that link, is it a one link stop shop I can send out just in the description box below to your website, and it's self-explanatory how you go through it to maybe approach you guys or link up?
The whole principle of what we're trying to achieve, and you're absolutely right. We don't talk about calories hardly at all, and we don't talk about the word diet because as soon as I hear the word diet, I'm miserable and hungry just from the saying of the word. And what we're trying to achieve is a longer and healthier life. So we call it prolongevity. So longevity with pro in front of it, prolongevity.co.uk. And we've also got quite an active Facebook group, Wellness with Prolongevity. And you will find everything there. There's lots of free information and you can contact me through that or through Twitter.
Perfect, Graham. And that's a great way to wrap it up. And it's also easy to remember, actually, whatever about having the link, because it is spelled as it sounds, two words, pro longevity. There's no fancy kind of twisting of the words there to confuse people.
Does what
Excellent.
it says on the tin.
It does what it says in the tin. Now, international audiences might not recognize that as we do. That's Ronseal, the paint and varnish product. Very famous catchphrase. Does what it says on the tin. That's what we're all about on this podcast, with you with Prolongevity. So thanks a lot, Graham, and we'll circle back in a while and see how things are going.
Thank you so much, Ivor. And we mustn't forget your book, Ivor. We haven't mentioned your book.
Oh,
And you've heard me say this before, right? I've read all the bloody books and I've read a lot of the source papers. And I think you know me well enough to know that I don't do bullshit. If I say it, I mean it. It is my go-to source. I have learnt so much from you, Ivor, about lipid profiles, about the coronary artery calcium score, which we haven't had time to discuss today. It's all in your book. And I always say to people, if you're only going to buy one book, buy Ivor's book.
Thanks a lot, Graham. No, that's great to hear. But yeah, myself and Dr. Gerber, we did bust ass on that over a long period of time, multiple editors to get all the information in, but in a way that people can flow through it, approachable. And I think it's really paid off. So only published one book, but at least we put our back into it. So. Oh, and one more thing before I go. I believe you've been pulling in a few awards lately for you and your outfit. Is that right?
It is, Ivor. We've kind of won the pharmacy Oscars and the BAFTAs. So there are two huge awards in pharmacy. One is the Chemist and Druggist Award, and the Chemist and Druggist is almost as old as the profession itself. And we won. I'd won numerous of their awards in the past for the pharmacists, but to win it for prolongevity is fantastic. That kind of peer recognition. So we won the Chemist and Druggist Award for innovation. Then it was also put in for another big award through the Pharmacy Business Magazine, Public Health, and we won their Public Health Award. So we've in January won these two big awards sort of back to back, and it's great, I suppose, for my ego, but it's great because it's added credibility to what we're doing, and it's brought a lot more people to my door. So yes, thanks for mentioning it.
Great, thanks a lot, Graham. And we'll circle back, as I say, in a while, and maybe check back in on this viral problem. But we stayed away from that today.
Good to see you again. Take care.
Thanks, Graham. Bye now. And just a reminder that I do need support to continue putting together all of this content. And at patreon.com/Ivor Cummins, or for PayPal, please see the description below this video or the pinned comment, and you can do a one-off or a monthly support. So I'd really appreciate that, guys, and keep me getting the science out there and countering perhaps the more biased corporate type science. Thank you.